Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hector and I'm initially from San Diego. My father is Canadian and my mother is from Philadelphia originally. My Bigfoot encounter happened in 1986 when I was 14 years old in Alberta in Canada. I grew up in a rather squalid and run-down high-rise apartment block in downtown San Diego, a single child with two really dreadful parents. I do not say that lightly, because I don't wish to be unkind about the two people that raised me in the very early part of my life. You see, my father was a very quiet, unassuming man who never said a single word, and he was ruled by an iron rod by my hot-headed mother. My mother was a monster. I knew of no other word to describe her. Every word that came out of her mouth was vile, vulgar, and obscene. And every time she spoke, it would be a swear word or she would curse everything and everyone, and invariably find herself caught up in all kinds of neighbourhood disputes and squabbles. It was not uncommon to find my mother having a huge barmy or fight with another woman, which would invariably always involve physical altercations that meant pulling of hair and heavy punching, bloody noses, and sometimes broken parts of the body like wrists and ankles. It was never ending. I was one of my mother's best punching bags, and whenever she was mad at me, or with anybody in the world, I was the one that was the target of all this beating. She would beat me black and blue with a huge leather belt, and my father would just sit back watching without saying a word. Looking back, I think he was afraid of my bullying mother, but never once did he ever intervene on my behalf or stick up for me. It did not help that my parents were very poor and money was hard to come by. Much of it was spent on weed, which my parents loved to smoke. They would while away the long monotonous hours in a stoned state. Sometimes at the grand age of 14, I truly felt like the only adult in our home. I hate to tell you that I didn't love my parents, but resented and despised them. In hindsight, being that much older, I don't have that same amount of animosity towards them, and I choose to forgive them, because I don't want to give them the satisfaction of living my life with bitterness and hatred towards them. My mother had always told me that I was the biggest inconvenience in her life, and she wished I had never been born. You have no idea how that shatters your confidence and self-esteem as a child growing up. It certainly did for me. One day I decided enough was enough and I was going to run away. And that was the day, armed with my meagre savings in a small suitcase, I boarded a Greyhound bus that was heading towards Vancouver. I was surprised that nobody asked me any awkward questions. But if anyone was going to ask me anything, I was going to tell them that I was visiting an aunt of mine in Canada. Luckily, I did even have an envelope with her address on it, because I really did have an aunt who was living there. I was lucky that I was a tall kid and looked very much older than my 14 years of age. I still remember sitting on that bus which was a long 21-hour journey to Vancouver. And as we drove further and further away from San Diego, I could feel a sense of huge relief wash over my body, like a gentle, refreshing rain shower. I had no idea what I was going to do once I got to Vancouver. But you know what? I didn't really care. Sleeping in a cardboard box on a street corner was infinitely more preferable than living in a high-rise apartment block with my abusive mother and my dead quiet father. I was sitting next to a very nice gentleman on the bus who told me that he was being picked up by his brother in Vancouver, who would be driving all the way to Alberta. I wasted no time in asking this gentleman for a ride. I didn't even know where Alberta was, but I figured if it was good enough for him, it was good enough for me. So I lied and I told him my aunt lived there, and he eagerly accepted my request, saying that it would be a pleasure to give me a lift. I fast forward a couple of days, and I had been living rough in the Alberta countryside for a couple of days. I'd been sleeping under the stars in a beautiful clearing in the open wilderness, and had infinitely more fun than I'd had in the first 14 years of my life in that high-rise apartment block with my parents. I had run out of money. Nothing was left in the world for me, when quite suddenly a woman approached me, just out of the blue like that. She was in her 60s with a smooth white skin, grey curly hair, and bright blue twinkling eyes that were so full of life and mischief. "I can smell a runaway a mile off," she said, looking at me curiously. My mouth dropped open. How did she know, I wondered? Was it that obvious? Was she going to tell the police about me? "Come with me," she said. "You look like you could do with a good meal inside you, and a decent wash wouldn't hurt either." The lady took me to her cabin in the Alberta countryside that was a little shabby, but it was cosier and more welcoming than anything I'd ever known. Her topsy-turvy home was literally in the most remote area in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by exquisite mountainous valleys, wooded areas, beautiful lakes, and endless rambling wilderness that literally stretched back for miles on end. Fast forward a few weeks, and I have to tell you, the most extraordinary thing happened. I was now living in Alberta, Canada, with this lovely woman that I had encountered the very day that my money ran out. Talk about good luck. She had become my guardian angel, if ever I did see one. She was a remarkable, kind woman with a heart of gold, and her name was Sophia. I had told her my entire story about my abusive parents, and she was so determined to never, 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 never let me go back to that horrible San Diego apartment. "I will not have you going back to that dingy life with those dreadful abusive parents of yours," she said to me. "You deserve so much better than that." What if the police come looking for me? What if they retrace my footsteps? I mean, they'll have a record of my presence on that Greyhound bus, won't they? I said. "There are always ways and means of never being found," she said. "From now on, you're my nephew, who has come to live with me, and we'll call you Carl if anybody asks." But you know what? Nobody ever did. "If you're sure," I said. I don't want to impose." "Absolutely not," she said. "It'll be good having your young blood around the place, and you're not imposing at all. Not at all, do you understand?" I nodded. For the first time in my young life, someone had shown me compassion and love, and tears of relief and joy poured down my face. I was to discover that Claudia had also attempted to run away from home several times, but had been dragged back kicking and screaming by the police when she was a young girl. Her parents had both been alcoholics, so I'd seemed to have found a kindred spirit who really understood my plight. From that day on, Sophia became like a real mother to me, like the mother I never had. Sophia actually dyed my blonde hair black, just in case I had been registered as a missing person, and the police came around asking awkward questions, but I'm glad to say that that never happened. Maybe my mother had never reported me missing, but was probably so thrilled to see the back of me. I guess I'll never know. Sophia had been a teacher in her younger days, so she did an amazing job in homeschooling me. In my spare time, I would always frequent the woods on her land. The woods were full of beautiful aspen trees, oaks, maples, and spruce, and they were exceedingly gorgeous, teeming with an abundance of wildlife. There was also a stunning, shimmering silver lake on the left-hand side of the valley, where I would sit for ages, hiding behind a huge rocky outcrop, and it was there that I would watch the deer congregate as they came to drink. I had seen a lynx drinking there once before, and several times I had seen elk, bison, and even the occasional black bear, and even on the odd occasion a grizzly from time to time. One day, as I was hiding behind the rocky outcrop with my binoculars pinned on the lake, something that I just loved to do, I saw the most majestic fish eagle hovering over the water like a low-flying hovercraft, and then diving down to retrieve a huge fish. I was passionate about eagles. I watched in awe as my binoculars focused on this incredible bird, tearing off the fleshy flesh from its bones and tucking into the soft meat. Suddenly I noticed that everything around the lake had retreated. Some of the elk that had been there for a while and had been drinking the water suddenly scattered away as if something had frightened them. And a little while later a black bear that had gathered there seemed to be smelling the area with his nose and didn't appear to like what he was smelling, and then he also ran away, only too eager to make a hasty escape. Everything suddenly went deathly quiet around the lake, and I'd never seen the place become that still before. It would seem that even the cheerful bird song had all but retreated, and there was a slight breeze that appeared to have dissipated all of a sudden. All I could see was the large fish eagle, who was still perching on the branch of an elm tree, looking towards the trees as if he was waiting for something or someone to appear, but I could not imagine what or who. I did wonder what was going on, and that was when I saw him, a creature that has never graced the cover of science books ever before. Well, not the ones that I've ever read. It was formidable, it was majestic, powerful, and equally as imposing as a lion and as huge as a rhino. It was a cross between a great ape and a human, and it was utterly and totally flawless and magnificent. I was awestruck by this creature and paralysed by it, but not by fear, but rather by sheer shock and horror at what I was actually seeing. I almost had to pinch myself to assure myself that I was indeed seeing this creature, and that this was not a dream. The creature was swinging its arms as it walked, and it was so graceful and majestic and agile in its movements. I noticed under its arms he appeared to be carrying something that looked like a scroll, something rolled up. Maybe it was an elk skin. What on earth was this creature, I did wonder. The creature was covered from head to toe with long human-like red-brown hair that seemed to shimmer in the sun like really healthy hair tends to do. I'm assuming the creature was male because of his monstrous size. He stood at about 9 feet tall and weighed at the very least 900 pounds. His torso was utterly massive, and his long arms that fell below the knees positively rippled with muscle. In human terminology, we would describe the creature as being absolutely ripped. But for a man to look like this, he would have to pump himself with hundreds of artificial steroids to achieve such muscular gains. I would describe this creature as a bipedal gymnast, bodybuilder, and acrobat all rolled into one. He was strong, athletic, agile, flexible, coordinated, and exceedingly powerful. His head was beautifully cone-shaped, and with the binoculars I made out a long, pink-like, hairless face, a very large flat nose, prominent brow ridge, and deep-set brown eyes. Suddenly the creature made a whistling sound that even I could hear from the other side of the lake. It was very shrill. I watched the fish eagle responding to that whistle almost immediately by flying towards the hairy humanoid and perching on his outstretched forearm. I sensed that the eagle had a relationship with the hairy man and appeared so comfortable and familiar with the creature, almost as if they were friends. He then bounced from the hairy man's forearms to his shoulders, where he perched indefinitely. I watched in total amazement as the large hairy humanoid waded through the shallower parts of the lake, with the eagle perched on his shoulders. As he did this, the fish eagle was surveying the water with his beady, predatory eyes, looking for any movement that came from beneath. And then suddenly he saw a fish in the water, and he would dart off the humanoid's shoulders and just rush into the water to retrieve a fish, never ever missing. He was that good. The hairy man took out the rolled elk skin from under his arm and placed the fish into it. Every time one was caught, he would unroll the elk skin, and then he would twist it up like a bag. The fish eagle used the hairy creature's shoulders like a portable moving branch, and it seemed that they both benefited from this incredibly successful fishing arrangement that they had together. Before long, the two of them literally shared all the fish that was in the bag. The big hairy giant sat on the side of the lake, with the eagle still perched on his shoulder. He handed the eagle a fish, who started tucking into it greedily. He was now using the humanoid ape's massive shoulders like a huge tree branch, and he kept his fish in his large talons while tucking into the juicy meat. I also watched the hairy ape-like creature diving into the fish with equal gusto. He was really enjoying the meal. Once he had finished his fill, I noticed that he smacked his lips and then rolled up the elk skin tightly like a bag. I think there must have been only 1.5 fish left inside. I watched the eagle flying away. It soared into the sky majestically, and then it was gone. It was breathtakingly beautiful to watch. What an amazing bird. The hairy humanoid sat by the lake for a long while, looking reflective, almost as if he was thinking about the things he had to do, or what he was planning to eat later on. I don't know, but he looked deep in thought. He then began to throw pebbles in the water, and I watched where they landed. He was watching also, and it became a game for him that he seemed to appear to be enjoying very much. After a while, the hairy humanoid left the lake, disappearing into the woods, and I have to say, I did feel very disappointed. I had so enjoyed watching him. He was so majestic and such a powerful creature, and this had been totally the most wonderful, unexpected experience of my life, something that I was truly privileged to see. I could not wait to tell Claudia about my incredible encounter. I was just about to go when I saw something peeking at me over the rocky outcrop where I'd been hiding. It was the face of the hairy humanoid that I had just only seen moments before. He looked at me with seemingly amused brown eyes, and I did not detect an ounce of malice or hostility from the creature. Our eyes did meet for a moment, and the creature held my gaze ever so briefly, and then he walked away. And I really got the sense he was saying, "Do not think I didn't see you watching me over there with the eagle. I knew you were there all along." When I told Sophia about my encounter, she told me that she'd seen the creature before herself. One time she'd owned a dog called Paddy, a black Scottish terrier. She told me that she couldn't find him anywhere and became incredibly frantic and kept calling out for him, but she got no answer. Finally, she heard some terrified yelps, and she ran out to see that her dog was being attacked by a lone wolf, who was trying to lunge into her dog's flesh. Suddenly she heard a monstrous roar, and then she saw the humanoid ape lunging towards the wolf, who became terrified and tried to escape. But the humanoid grabbed the wolf and killed it instantly, throwing it violently against a rocky stone. And then its head just broke apart, almost like an egg. And then little Paddy came running towards me, she told me, into my arms. And the hairy humanoid just looked at me with these gentle brown eyes, threw the wolf over its shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and retreated into the woods. I truly believed he helped me. Yes, he got himself a good meal as well out of it, but he definitely saved Paddy's life, and I think he deliberately intervened on my behalf. I was to discover that over the years there were people in Alberta who had seen sightings of creatures like this. Some accounts were positive, and some people had experienced terrifying encounters with the mythical creature. so not everyone had a happy tale to tell. It was only in the year 2009. I was married by then with a beautiful wife and 2 lovely children living in Alberta, and one day we were all watching a program about Bigfoots, and that was when I was able to put the name to the hairy humanoid that I had seen between the ages of 14 and 15 when I was living with Sophia in her cabin on that remote and wild large area of land in Alberta. I now knew the creature I had seen was a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or a Yeti. Sadly, my beautiful friend, mother, guardian angel Claudia, whom I loved with every fragment of my being, died in 2003, and she is so sorely missed. She quite literally changed my life all those long years ago, and saved me from 2 parents who potentially could have seriously damaged me emotionally if I had stayed with them for very much longer. I always admired that courageous, plucky little 14-year-old boy that had the confidence to run away. I would like to tell all your listeners that some people who go missing do so intentionally, because believe me, that not everything that goes on behind closed doors is as straightforward as you may think it is. I know that better than most. As for my parents, I do not know what became of them, and as callous and as cold as it may sound, I don't really care either, although I do forgive them for the way they treated me all those years ago, because I don't want to hold any bitterness in my heart. So that is my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Avery, and my Bigfoot encounter happened on the 8th of February 2019. So in truth, it was as recently as last year. But after the COVID-19 crisis, it does seem like an incredibly long time ago now. Truly, I had never envisaged sharing my incredible story with anyone, because I knew my claims would potentially be dismissed and even ridiculed. You see, I would never have believed my story myself, so why should I expect anyone to believe my story? If someone else were to share my story with me, I would have laughed and said that it was completely impossible for something so incredulous and so far-fetched to happen to an individual, especially someone like myself. Yet my story is absolutely true, and it did happen, and even a year later, it seems so extraordinarily surreal. I'm just an ordinary 35-year-old woman with a relatively predictable life. There's nothing particularly special about me. I work as a marketing consultant for a large company in Washington and have been married to my husband Matt for over 10 years now, and I have a daughter Felicia who is now 7. On the subject of Bigfoot, I had been exposed to television programs about him before, but I never watched them. I also flicked quickly past all those YouTube videos about the hairy humanoid. I did think that those so-called Bigfoot sightings were all fictitious and without any real truth behind them. I believe Bigfoot to be as implausible and as unlikely as the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, something relegated rather to the realms of myth and legend. It was an enigma to me that people would actually believe that such a creature existed in the forests of North America. I do remember once, several years ago, actually discussing the subject of Bigfoot with my husband Matt, and I'm ashamed to admit that I really did make fun of people who did believe in the mythical beast. How could they fall for such elaborated, ridiculous fiction, I would wonder? If such a creature really did exist, we would have documented evidence, clear photographs and physical remains, surely. My story starts in February 2019, as my younger sister Stacy was going to be celebrating her 21st birthday in Oregon. I was used to making the 6-hour road trip from Washington to Portland, where I grew up, and where my parents still resided. My sister was having a beautiful party and about 100 people, and it was going to be in a venue not far from our family home. She had told me how excited she was about it, and who she was inviting, what warm clothes she was going to wear in that winter weather, and how she just could not wait to see me there. I know it sounds crazy, but I just didn't have a good feeling about the trip, not only because of the freezing conditions and the snowy weather, but something in my gut felt distinctly off. I even expressed my doubts to my husband, who encouraged me not to go. Just tell Stacy that you cannot come because you do not want to drive in these crazy, crazy wintry conditions. I mean, look at the weather forecast. It's predicting serious snowstorms. It's encouraging people to stay indoors, not to make any unnecessary trips for safety reasons. Surely it's not unreasonable for you not to go under the circumstances. You can always make it up to her another time, he assured me. No, I insisted. I do have to go. Stacy is my sister, and you only turned 21 once. She's so excited about her party. I can't let her down. I have to go. In truth, I would have loved not to go. I could have easily been persuaded not to, but I wasn't going to tell Matt that. The thought of a 6-hour journey that would undoubtedly be lengthened by the crazy winter weather was not something I relished at all. On the contrary, I was dreading the journey, because at the very best of times, I did not consider myself to be the greatest driver. But I was not going to share those nagging doubts about my driving competence with my husband. If he had any inkling of them, he would have never allowed me to go. I packed my car with extra blankets, flashlights, lots of food and drinks, as I had learnt from my dad that travelling in winter conditions you should prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I had heard of people that were stuck in snowstorms before with not enough food or drink, and only having the clothes on their back to keep them warm. Some, in their utter desperation, had ripped the cushioning and lining out of the car seats just to stay warm and keep alive. I still remember getting into my car at that very moment and just wanting to dash back into the house and change my mind about going. I resisted that overwhelming temptation, and I started driving through Washington. And I was already struggling with the dreadful snowy conditions out there, and I'd only just left the house. This did not bode well for a good start. The weather was utterly horrendous, and the radio announcer was urging people to stay indoors. Folks, it's only going to be getting worse out there, so please stay indoors and keep warm. People are sliding in their cars all over the place on those icy roads, and there is mayhem out there. Do not leave your home unless it's an absolute emergency. A 20-mile stretch of Interstate 90 may be closed shortly due to spin-outs and poor visibility. The weather out there is treacherous, folks, and the snowstorms and blizzard-like conditions are causing major collisions. So hang in there, folks, and don't take any unnecessary trips. I switched off the radio and tuned into a musical station. It was chaos and bedlam on those roads, and even driving through Washington, I had experienced some really slippery conditions and some near misses with other drivers, some who had hooted at me furiously, and others who had waved their fists at me angrily. Was I really such a dreadful driver, I wondered. I consoled myself with that these horrendous wintry conditions would have made the hardened, most skilled drivers actually lose control. The snow was just falling down heavily, and the winds were punneling the windows of my car, causing absolutely everything to rattle and shake under its thunderous vibrations. Visibility was greatly impaired, and it was hard to make out many of the cars in front of me, as everything was so foggy and covered with this white vapoury mist that was very hard to see through. The snowing was relentless, and in some areas it was reported that there were 6 to 10 inches of snow on the ground, making the driving conditions hazardly treacherous. I was really beginning to regret not taking my husband's wise advice. My car was now driving up this narrow, windy road that was set against a high mountainous outcrop on one side and over a very sheer rocky cliff face on the other side, which dipped down to the lower forested valley. I was beginning to fear this road that I was driving up, because the snowy conditions, punneling relentless winds, and poor visibility had become a huge headache for me, and it was all I could do was to keep my car from sliding all over the place on this sheer drop. I knew now how crazy I was to be driving in these ghastly, appalling conditions. I really did need my head examining. Then it happened, and these were the longest seconds of my entire life, when everything became slow motion, as my car skidded, somersaulted, and flew off the narrow road and went tumbling down the cliff to the lower valley. I remember my life flashing before me like a video of very fast images all of my life, and I knew quite suddenly that I was going to die. As weird as it may sound, in those final seconds, I became resigned to my plight, fully expecting to die on impact, and literally coming to terms with that reality so swiftly. It was now all out of my control, and I knew that I was powerless to change a thing. I squeezed my eyes as tightly as I could, and I braced for impact, and it happened. The car rolled over a couple of times, and then there was a thunderous, almighty crash. Then all became very still. But I remember hearing the bird song in the valley, so sweet and so pretty against this violent assault of crashing heavy metal on this peaceful snowy clearing. I could not believe I was still alive, but I was bleeding from a gash in one of my arms, and my legs were trapped between my seat and all the crushed metal. The good news was that my legs did appear to be fine because I could move them, but the pressure of the heavy metal on them was causing them to go numb and lose feeling pretty quickly. Even so, every part of my body ached, and I was in dreadful agonizing pain because I felt as if I had been through a food processor. I was that beat up, and everything hurt, from my aching head to my bruised feet. I couldn't get out of the car. I was well and truly trapped, and I realized that my cell phone was buried beneath the metal somewhere and was simply not retrievable, so I couldn't call anyone for help. There was no point in screaming or calling out, because no one would hear me. I was certain of that. There was not a soul in sight. I was in a very remote valley. My car was lying in a wooded clearing surrounded by tall, majestic trees that would easily have hidden my car from passing drivers. And I knew no one would have seen my accident, because I was the only driver foolish, stubborn, pig-headed and impulsive enough to drive up that sheer cliff face to start with, in such hazardous conditions. Everybody else clearly had a lot more sense than I did. I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness, so I figured I must have bashed my head a little and sustained some concussion. It was freezing, and I was starting to shiver with cold, but I had no way of retrieving my food parcels, drinks, or warm blankets, because they were all in the back area of my car, well beyond my reach. I could not feel my legs anymore, and I was experiencing the most awful pins and needles as the blood circulation was starting to become cut off. Everything in the valley was carpeted with thick layers of white snow, and it clung to the trees like fragile Christmas decorations. It was amazing how beauty could so often mask the treachery of these frightful conditions. The heavy snow continued to fall relentlessly, and the howling winds rattled the wreck of my car. All I remember from that point on is my whole car being moved. I could hear noises of metal being pulled apart, and in that semi-conscious state I felt sure I had been found, and that the jaws of life had been used to retrieve my body. I could feel my body being lifted out of the car and my legs suddenly being freed from that metal trap. I could feel the cold blasts of icy freezing air against my face. I sensed I was being carried away by very strong arms, possibly to a waiting ambulance, so I thought. That was all I could actually recall. I remember slowly waking up. My whole body was aching with pain, and I was groaning in agony. And I looked up to find 3 pairs of brown, earnest eyes staring down at me. I started to scream. I was terrified. These creatures were monsters, I thought. What on earth were they? My heart was throbbing violently in my chest, and I was certain that this was all a dreadful nightmare. Surely this could not be real. The biggest creature, seemingly the alpha male, was easily 10 feet tall and 1,000 pounds, but the smallest was only 4 foot. The creatures were covered in long human-like brown hair, and the only way I can describe them is being like a humanoid ape. The ape-like qualities were seen in their very long arms that reminded me of a orangutan monkey, only infinitely more human-like in appearance and a lot bigger. Another thing that struck me about the creatures was their sheer overall width, size and weight. I mean, they were hefty creatures, but agile and graceful despite their huge size. All of them rippled with muscle that you could see moving under their hair, and they had massive shoulders and cone-shaped heads with a tiny little point at its peak. I watched the female creature push the other two hairy humanoids away from me. She didn't want them to overcrowd me. It was like she was taking charge of me. I knew she was female because she had breasts that were covered in hair. I noticed that she had a very serene, gentle nature, and she appeared to be very kind and caring. As I observed the creatures, I discovered they meant me no harm and were actually trying to help me. I realized in shocked horror that I was in a cave somewhere with a family of Bigfoots who were watching over me. They had retrieved all my items from my car, like my blankets, drink and food, which they had placed right next to me. But sadly, there was no sign of a cell phone, which was a disappointment to me. I cried out in pain as I felt all the terrible shooting pains bubbling up in my body like volcanic eruptions of molten lava that could not be calmed or stilled. It was excruciating, and I was desperate for some painkillers. As if sensing my need for pain relief, the creature gave me some leaves to chew. She put some in her mouth to demonstrate to me, and then pointed to the area on my hip that I had been clutching with agony. I was willing to try anything, so I obediently chewed the leaves, and I kid you not, within 5 minutes the pain dissipated. To this day, I have no recollection of what those leaves were, but I want to tell you this: they work more brilliantly than any painkiller I have ever used in alleviating my pain. Over the next few days, the creatures watched over me tirelessly. The female Bigfoot put these leaves that she gave me to chew on other areas of my body, with gashes and scrapes, and they all healed remarkably well. I did sleep most of the time as I had so little energy, but I sipped my drinks, ate a little food, and covered myself with my warm blankets. I think I was too grateful to be alive and too comatose to really care about being stuck in a cave with a family of Bigfoots. I did not spend much time alert in the Bigfoot's cave because I was in a concussed state most of the time. But when I was awake, I would sometimes see the creatures chattering among themselves in a strange language. The mother Bigfoot simply adored her little child, and she was always stroking its hair and cradling it in her arms and chattering to it in very soft, loving tones. She would also ruffle through the folds of his hair, removing nits, thorns and leaves that had got caught up and tangled within its layers. The young Bigfoot loved playing on the cave floor with sticks and pebbles, just like a kid does with Lego blocks, and it was always chuckling to itself in delight. I remember giving the Bigfoot some of my salted potato crisps, which they loved, and they were smacking their lips with pleasure afterwards. I think they enjoyed the saltiness and the crunchiness of them, and they liked eating them alongside the dead squirrel that they would share and pass between each other like a large hot dog. They did not like the chocolate that I offered them, but spat it out in disgust. The little kid loved playing with my empty soda bottles and my crisp packets for hours on end, and he was fascinated and intrigued by them, and particularly enjoyed the rustling sounds of the crisp packets, as well as squeezing the plastic bottle in his big hands and moulding them into different shapes. He twisted one of those cola bottles into the shape of a tree, and it was brilliant. I've never seen someone manipulate plastic like that. I think he must have had incredibly strong hands to do that. I do not know how long I was in that Bigfoot cave, but it was possibly a few days, maybe 3 or 4. Once the storm had subsided, the Bigfoot male, who had been very quiet during my whole stay, came and picked me up in his big bare arms. I should have been terrified, but I knew that these amazing creatures meant me no harm, and I had learnt how incredibly intelligent and human-like they were from my observations. I discovered that this cave was on the side of a mountainous ridge, which would have been impossible for me to navigate myself, let alone even climb. For me it would have been a physical impossibility. The cave was so well hidden that the natural eye would never have known it was there. I was amazed at how incredibly agile the Bigfoot was, as he carried me with effortless ease, balancing so perfectly on the ridge with the masterfulness of an acrobat. I have ridden camels, elephants and horses before, and I would always feel all those bumps beneath me. But not once did I experience this with the male Bigfoot. The ride down the ridge was as smooth as it gets. When the creature walked down the sheer mountainous ridge, I did hear the sound of human voices in the valley near to where my car had crashed. I could hear a voice saying, "How the heck did she get out of here? It seems like the metal has been pulled back around the seat area," said another. "It's not humanly possible to do this." "The big question," said another, "is where in God's name is she? That's what I want to know." The creature put me down on the ground and pointed towards the voices, and then he glided away and vanished from my sight. I was actually sad to see him go. In a strange way, I had grown attached to these remarkable hairy giants that had shown me such gentleness and compassion. I cried out to the human voices, which turned out to be the police who had discovered my wreck and were searching for me. They were amazed to see me in such good nick and asked me so many awkward questions, but I kept my mouth firmly shut. I was not going to give those Bigfoots away. So whenever they asked me something I didn't want to answer, I just said I can't remember. I sincerely doubted that they would have believed my crazy story anyway. To cut a long story short, I spent a couple of days in the hospital and then I returned home with a clean bill of health, suffering no long-term complications, which was miraculous in itself. I was sad that I had missed my sister's 21st birthday, but delighted to have had my life saved by those Bigfoots. If I had been left in that car, the blood supply to my legs would have been cut off by that crushed metal, and I would have been in serious trouble. I doubt I would have survived. The police could not understand how I'd got out of all that crushed metals, and how it had been pulled back so effortlessly to release my trapped legs, and how I had not frozen to death in the icy conditions that I was exposed to. They described my story as that of a miracle. So there you are. That's my story. And even my cynical husband believes me, because he knows I would never have made this up. I truly believe that that Bigfoot family saved my life, and this revelation has gladdened my heart and made me realize that there is so much good in this world out there.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Candy, and I live 25 minutes away from the city of Whitehorse in a spacious custom-designed home on 16 acres of land. Many of the custom-built houses in our part of the world look incredibly alike, with of course the exception of houses that are made from wooden logs. Where I live is so picturesque and stunningly beautiful, and my house has close access to wilderness trails, lakes, mountains and forests. Every time I wake up in the morning, I am literally surrounded by the most exquisite views of magnificent towering mountains reaching into the skies like vast massive pyramids that are particularly spectacular during the winter season when they are carpeted in thick layers of glistening white snow. Where I live is in the Yukon in northern Canada, well known for the stunning visual displays of the northern lights, known as the aurora borealis, that are usually seen whirling in blankets of exquisite greens that literally envelop the Yukon in an ethereal sense of mysterious intrigue. These lights are best seen in the countryside, unobstructed by the city lights of Whitehorse, because obviously the city lights can be distracting. Believe it or not, these glorious lights can sometimes change into rarer colours like pinks and reds and crimsons. I believe that the Yukon is in fact the most ideal place in the entire world for Bigfoots to live, as there is just so much never-ending wilderness here, water sources of so many kinds, and a teeming abundance of wildlife. Before I get to the pinnacle of my story about my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter, let me first explain my family setup to you. I'm the oldest daughter, with a younger sibling called Chloe, and I live in this very large house with both of my parents, whom work in the city of Whitehorse. My father works as a manager for a very well-known North American food chain, and my mother owns a souvenir shop selling trinkets and paintings to tourists who visit our part of the world. We get tons of tourists who come to Whitehorse because they love to go sleigh riding and are fascinated by the northern lights. And there's so much to do here, the list goes on. There's all kinds of things to do for outdoor enthusiasts and people who like action-packed holidays.
Even in 2018, I actually saw the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in Horsetail, and they spent 24 hours in the city on their royal tour of Canada, and I actually got to speak to Kate. That was 2 months after my Bigfoot encounter had occurred, to be exact. My story begins when one day my sister and I were on a summer break, and although there are tons of interesting things to do in the city of Whitehorse, we decided to go exploring one of the hiking trails that are literally yards away from our home. I mean, why not? We thought it would be great to go camping along the trail for a couple of days or so. My parents were nonchalant about us going, as long as we didn't camp too far away from the house, and took a rifle with us for protection, just in case we had an encounter with a bobcat or a bear. This all happened 2 years ago, to be precise, in 2018, when I was 17 years old and Candy was only 15. I'm ashamed to say that even though I've lived in this house for 17 long years, not once did I ever explore the trail close to our home. In truth, there are not many people that I've ever seen using that hiking trail before, as it isn't clearly marked. It's pretty old, rugged, and slightly overgrown. My dad reckons it's not been used since the turn of the century, and he's probably right. He said he couldn't find it anywhere when he was looking at a tourist map more recently. So it's an exceedingly old trail, leading to an area that I doubt has been frequented by hikers in recent years. Chloe and I are always prepared for the outdoors, as you can invariably imagine. I'm always kitted out with walking shoes, anoraks, camping equipment, you name it, because we have a very active outdoor life that involves swimming, canoeing, bicycling, horse riding, and even fishing. Believe me, Chloe and I have done it all. My sister and I got our backpacks prepared with everything we would need for our camping trip, such as flashlights, fire starters, sleeping bags, tents, and all the usual necessities. We then left on our merry way for our little adventure. We were very excited because it was just 2 of us camping under the stars, and the weather was seemingly perfect. We couldn't have wished for anything better. The first part of our hike was pretty strenuous and very exhausting because it was all uphill, and the trail ran through a vast wooded area filled with a selection of mixed trees, from spruces, firs, pines, cedars, and maple birch trees, and it was all enchantingly beautiful. We ran across a startled red fox that scurried away hurriedly, looking less than pleased to see us, and of course we encountered several snowshoe hares along our way, darting around the place looking surprised to encounter humans, almost as if they were saying, "What on earth are you doing here? You don't fit in around here." It was such a beautiful day, and my sister and I walked for hours, rarely enjoying the soft beams of sunlight on our faces. We listened to the beautiful bird song in the valley and watched the occasional moose that crossed our path and quickly tottered away. We finally reached a clearing, and it was the oddest thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. On the left-hand side of this wide open space was a very large area that looked exactly like an ancient Indian burial ground. Only that did not make any sense at all, because this was not an old burial ground by any means, but was exceedingly fresh. And although I'm no expert on these matters, I would say that none of these burial plots were more than 5 years old. There were about 8 mounds of freshly dug earth in the shape of very large, long graves, at approximately 8 to 10 feet in length and equally as wide. So these things were pretty massive. On the sides of each mounds were layers of big stones, and the individual graves were marked with strange sticks poking out of the ground, looking like weird kinds of menacing symbols, almost as if every stick represented the individual that had died in some kind of mystery code. "What in God's name is all this?" said Chloe, looking at me in horror. "This looks like the grave site of giants." We immediately got out of the area as fast as we could. The whole place had an ominous, airy feeling about it that left the hair on our necks standing on edge. A while of extra strenuous and exhilarating walking uphill led us to another open clearing, where we stumbled quite by chance upon another extraordinary sight that was so well camouflaged by the underlying brush that we almost failed to see it. I only happened to notice it because a very large black raven was perched on a branch close to the structure, and it was making that cawing sound that they usually make, which immediately got my attention. I studied the bird closely, and my eyes wandered towards the stacked basket-like formation standing beneath it. It looked like a massive igloo-type structure that was as big as a small hut, made with branches, twigs, and intertwined with vine leaves. We knew at once that something highly intelligent had actually made this hut, but who or what we could not imagine. We walked inside the igloo-like structure made of leaves and branches, and we saw some deerskins carpeting one area of the floor that covered a huge pile of grasses, making what appeared to be a makeshift bed that did look exceedingly comfortable and absolutely enormous. Whoever was lying here had to be huge. We saw a pile of what looked like sharpened stones and pieces of wood that reminded me of the instruments that Stone Age men used in prehistoric times. It was all utterly bizarre. I picked up some of those sharpened stones, and it was so sharp, I kid you not, I nearly sliced my finger off, much to my horror. None of my mother's kitchen knives at home were ever this sharp. Chloe and I were utterly bewildered and intrigued at the same time. We couldn't make sense of any of this. It was all so outer-worldly. It was almost like we had been teleported back to another time, like the Stone Ages. As we were leaving this igloo-like structure of branches and leaves, we noticed a fire pit outside the opening, and it had been used very recently, because we could tell that the ash was still warm to the touch. "It must be some wacko human living here," I said to my sister. "Someone who takes living off the grid to an extreme, and lives as close to nature as you can imagine." "Either that," said Chloe, "or maybe he's a psycho that escaped from the loony bin." She suddenly looked at me in alarm. "What about all those graves we saw? Maybe the psycho is going around killing people and burying them there. We could be next," she said, with a look of horror growing on her face. "Chloe," I scolded, "stop being so melodramatic. You watch too many of those ghastly horror movies. For a start, we don't know if those are actually graves in the first place. And for all we know, it's just a harmless vagrant who lives in here." "Harmless," said Chloe. "Really? You think it's harmless when it sharpened those stones to a fine point that nearly sliced your finger off? And you reckon he's harmless?" I was just about to scold Chloe again for overreacting when we heard the sound of very heavy feet coming towards us. Bear in mind, we were carrying backpacks at the time that had an awful propensity to rattle when we moved. I gestured to Chloe to be as quiet as possible, and we made it in time to hide behind the trunk of a very large cedar tree, where we hid, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was coming towards us sounded as hefty as a large elephant, without exaggeration, only it was someone who was bipedal, because they were definitely walking on 2 feet. I decided that it had to be the vagrant or the vagabond in the woods, who must be a seriously overweight individual to sound that massive, which was somewhat incongruous, I thought, for a man of the woods, who I thought should always be svelte and very fit. I appeared around the corner of the tree and was not prepared for what I was actually witnessing. It was a humanoid creature of about 10 to 11 feet tall that looked like a wild man, covered in long reddish-brown hair from head to toe. He had an elongated scowl and a pinky-brown hairless face that appeared rugged, weathered, incredibly leathered and extremely wrinkled. I'd heard of Bigfoots before, but this creature was more human than ape-like in his appearance. He was monstrously huge. I would say he was about 1,000 pounds and 6 feet in width, and he had the longest arms that I've ever seen in my life that fell well below his knees and could easily touch his toes. I can honestly say that this hairy humanoid is the scariest, most powerful, formidable creature that I've ever seen, equally on par with encountering a tiger or a lion. All I wanted to do in that moment was to hightail it as fast as I could out of the woods. I was utterly terrified. Just looking at this creature, while he was oblivious to our presence, literally sent waves of dread down my spine, and terror coursing through every vein in my body like a relentless steam train powered on full throttle, because the more that I observed this creature, the more terrified I became. Chloe and I had been walking all day. By now we were utterly exhausted, tired, and ravenous. And so when the humanoid creature ventured inside the igloo grass-like structure where he clearly lived, I pushed Chloe forward. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. "Now!" "I don't think I could move another muscle," Chloe moaned. "My legs are aching and everything hurts. I'm so tired and so hungry." "We need to camp as far away from him as possible," I said to Chloe. "Just try and walk a little bit further. Tomorrow we'll turn around and go back home. I promise." "This place has weirded me out," said Chloe. "I've never been so freaked out by something before. We should never have taken this trail. No one uses it anymore for good reason, it seems." Finally, Chloe and I found a little clearing close to a pretty creek, and it was far away enough from the giant humanoid for us to camp, making us feel a whole lot safer. We prepared a large fire pit, boiled some hot water to make a brew of sweet tea, and then we cooked some marinated chicken kebabs that I'd brought over the open grill, and we sat back and spoke about what we'd seen. "He wasn't human," said Chloe, looking at me intently, chewing a piece of chicken hungrily. "But he wasn't an ape either, was he?" "So is he a Bigfoot or not?" she asked. "He must be some kind of a Bigfoot," I said. "I imagine you get all types. Some may have more human-like characteristics, while others may look like apes more, I imagine." "Well, he did have very long arms and an exceedingly prominent brow ridge, so typical of a Bigfoot, I suppose," reflected Chloe, who knew just about everything there was to know about Bigfoot as a subject, because she had always been intrigued and fascinated by it for many years. However, I think our encounter with the hairy humanoid had shaken her to the core, because even though she tried to hide it, I could see she was well and truly rattled. "Whatever he was," I said, "he gave me the chills. He was one of the scariest creatures, whether he was a Bigfoot or not." That night we went to bed early. Our muscles were aching from our strenuous walking, and we couldn't wait to get some sleep. It was not long before we were fast asleep, leaving the strange experience of our peculiar day long behind us as we entered into a blissful, dreamlike state. Suddenly, at about 2 a.m. in the morning, we were awoken to something very big and heavy thumping our tent. We could actually watch the imprint of a hefty hand hitting our tent many times over, and whatever or whoever it was, they were making no secret of their presence. "It's him," whispered Chloe in horror. "I think he's going to kill us." I immediately grabbed my rifle, wondering whether to confront the creature or just stay in our tent and not react to the slapping sounds. While I was contemplating the next course of action, Chloe and I quickly placed our light helmets on for visibility and slipped into our walking shoes. By this time a short while had passed, and the slapping sounds on our tent had all but receded. I peered out of the tent very briefly, but saw nothing there, so I beckoned to Chloe that the coast was clear, and we ran for cover to some nearby trees, with our rifles at the ready. Soon we saw him again, the monstrous humanoid we had encountered yesterday. He was stomping around our camping spot like a grumpy old man, looking less than pleased. He began to growl, roar, and howl simultaneously, and then he started to shake our tents violently, creating the effect of a hazardous windstorm. He was trying to scare us out of our tents, like a fox prizing a rabbit out of its hole. Believe me, I was so relieved we were not in there. Suddenly the creature just tore our entire tent apart, and he shredded the tough canvas as if it was just tissue paper with his monstrous hands and dexterous sausage-like fingers. He then pulled our sleeping bags apart, and they dotted the clearing like pieces of firecrackers found after a July the 4th celebration. In his hands we literally watched this man bend the metal back of our packs like a piece of plasticine. We watched him just throw everything around the clearing like a rampaging rhino in an incandescent rage. Food parcels hung perilously on tree branches, and the rest of our clothes were strewn all over the place like a child's messy bedroom. Chloe and I were frozen to the spot in absolute fear. We simply could not move our bodies. We were immobilized by the escalating terror that we were feeling. Forget what they say about adrenaline giving you the ability to run away as fast as you can. Chloe and I were paralyzed by fear. We shook like jellies, and we just stood there like sitting ducks, almost waiting to be devoured by this enraged predator. Suddenly we heard him coming towards us. He must have sensed us or smelt us, and his flat nostrils flared up and his mouth curled back like a large cat to reveal a huge set of white human-like teeth. He growled at us, and that sound was so terrifying it was beyond anything I can ever start to describe, but it caused the ground to vibrate and to shake, and our eardrums to almost burst. If looks could kill, and if I ever saw hatred and evil, it was in those big brown eyes that held not an ounce of humanity in them. It was like they were devoid of any compassion. I truly sensed that this creature wanted to kill us. There was no doubt in my mind about that. "Shoot him," begged Chloe. "Shoot him, Candy, please." I want to tell you, against this monstrous beast, I truly felt like a silly little toddler, bringing out a kid's water pistol that I was pointing at the creature. My hands were shaking so very much, and how I managed to aim that rifle I will never know. But the booming sound of the pistol got the creature even madder. He started lunging towards me, reaching out with a monstrous hairy hand to grab me, while he roared at me at the same time. I pointed the rifle at his jaw and blew off a corner of his face. I could hardly believe I'd done it. The creature looked totally startled as some of his teeth and a piece of jaw went flying into the air like pieces of shrapnel. I think he was in desperate pain because he let out a shrill, agonizing scream, and clutching his jaw that was oozing with blood, he ran away from us as fast as he could. Chloe and I were startled out of our frozen comatose state, and suddenly we were energized with a seemingly superhuman energy that enabled us to run through that wooded clearing as fast as we possibly could. When we got home, we were so knocked out and so utterly exhausted that we slept for 24 hours straight. Once we'd recovered, the first words out of my father's mouth was, "What the hell happened to you both? What on earth did you see?" We told our horrified parents our startling story, and my father is convinced we encountered a wild man or a Bigfoot of some kind. I truly do not know what we actually saw. Is there a difference between a Bigfoot and a wild man? I do not know the answer to that question, but whatever we saw, it did behave like a rabid dog. I would expect something that looked more human to be less violent, but this thing was exceedingly dangerous. I do believe if it had not blown off the corner of his jaw, that Chloe and I would be dead by now. I'm in no doubt in my mind about that. My experience has put me off hiking, because I believe the more common hikers' trails are invariably safer. So it hasn't put me off hiking, because I think they're much safer if you go on the normal hiking routes. I think these things, whatever they are exceedingly territorial and stay away from humans. I'm convinced there are others like him living in the Yukon because of the burial ground that we saw. So if you are the type of person who prefers an action-filled holiday rather than sunning yourself on a tropical beach, why not consider popping up to Horsetail? Who knows, you might end up buying a trinket from my mother's shop. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Marcus, and when I was born on October the 5th, 1966, my life began with a veil of mystery shrouding it, of which the answers have never been found, leaving me with unanswered questions over my family heritage that I may never be able to resolve. But all these years later, I've come to terms with all that. My strange, mysterious birth is more aligned with the world of fiction novels rather than those of fact, but I assure you that my story is true. I was found lying in a little basket in the pew of a local church with a tiny note pinned to my baby blanket saying, "To whom this may concern. I'm an Irish Catholic immigrant. If my parents knew about my baby, I would be in heaps and heaps of trouble, and they would automatically disown me. I love my baby, but I cannot keep him. Please take very good care of him for me, and make sure that he has a great life. His name is Marcus. Yours very gratefully, Anonymous. P.S. Please let my baby know that he was always loved, and none of this was ever his fault." I gather there were newspaper articles written about me requesting that my frightened mother of the mystery note to come forward to claim her baby, but she never ever did. I was to learn that in those days, especially if you grew up in a very strict religious home, having a baby out of wedlock was highly frowned upon. Today it's so much more acceptable, but back then it was very difficult for many young women. I never held any bitterness towards my mother for literally giving me up. I'm almost certain that she was a young teenager at the time who hid her pregnancy under layers of loose-fitting clothing from her parents, and possibly gave birth to me in a confined space while her parents may have been fast asleep. I cannot imagine what that poor girl went through, having me without any medical supervision, and then having to give me up by whisking me off to the local church and leaving me there lying in a basket on a pew. It must have been the hardest thing that she ever had to do in her young life. I cannot imagine what she went through, not only days after my birth, but months and years later. My only hope is that was not ravaged by guilt, or ended up having a full life and children of her own. Who knows, I may actually have some brothers and sisters out there. I sincerely hope I do. I initially started my early life in an orphanage, and then I was taken from one foster home to another. When I was 8, I ended up in a foster home in Kentucky with 2 parents who I believe only fostered me because of the state benefits they attained for my care. Truly, they did not take care of me out of the goodness of their heart or because they loved children. On the contrary, they would have preferred not to have had me around at all. But I did have my uses, which they took great advantage of, like mucking out the stables and feeding the pigs and the chickens. They were not terrible people in any way, but they most certainly treated me differently to their natural children, like getting me to do all the dirty jobs around the farm and giving me second-hand clothing and cast-offs. At Christmas, I was the one that got far inferior gifts to the other kids. One Christmas I got a pair of socks, for example, and my brother got a train set, while my foster sister got the doll she'd always wanted. When there were kiddies' birthday parties, for example, my foster parents went out on a limb for their real kids, insisting on giving them the most fantastic parties. But when it was my birthday, I was very lucky if my mother even made me a cake. As you can imagine, there were times I felt very left out and excluded. But I did understand that not being related by blood meant that I would never ever be fully accepted, and I did come to terms with that. I was definitely the black sheep of the family, and I knew I was there for monetary gain rather than to be loved or wanted. I did find my own solace and peace growing up, as I diverted my attention away from the politics of the inner family circle, and I focused my attention on the natural world. I adored animals, especially dogs, because they love so unconditionally. They never judge you, and they accept you just as you are, without expecting you to conform to worldly ideals. I also loved the horses, and I adored the pigs and even the chickens on our farm. I had a passion for all the animals, and one time when my father was going to kill one of the pigs for a pot roast, I know it's hypocritical of me because I love pork, but I loved that pig a whole lot more. I took that creature to the woods, and I literally set him free, and I think he knew what I was doing. I do not know what actually became of him because he never came back to our farm and seemed delighted to be free. My father believed that someone had actually stolen the pig, but there were reports of a huge massive pig seen rummaging in the forests in Kentucky many months later, so I hope he had a great life and was never turned into bacon, but I guess I'll never really know. My brother Paul sensed his parents were not inclusive with me growing up, so he became prejudiced towards me. Although we did sometimes play together, he grew extremely distant towards me, and we never became close. My sister Amelia was very sweet, but she wasn't interested in anything that involved rough and tumble, but liked to read books and play snakes and ladders, and genuinely preferred to remain indoors most of the time. My foster parents lived in a shabby farmhouse with stables and pretty run-down outbuildings that were all in a dilapidated state and needing money spending on them to fix up the place, which my parents never had. The farmhouse was always in a mess and could have done with some TLC, but they really weren't interested in all that stuff. And to be honest with you, neither was I. I loved the great outdoors, and every ounce of my spare time, apart from my homework and doing household chores, was spent in the woods that flanked all the neighbouring farms and stretched back for miles and miles to eternity. They were so incredibly beautiful, and always a place of mysterious intrigue, and where I would spend so many times in soulful reflection, which I did a lot as a young boy. I had a favourite spot in the woods where there was a huge open clearing and a gloriously large creek, where I simply loved to watch the white-tailed deer coming to the water to drink. I always loved their gentle, serene natures, and I never ever got tired of watching them. They eventually got so used to me just sitting there eyeing them and watching them all the time that after a while I became like a fixture and fitting in the woods that they no longer were afraid of. One day as I entered the woods, I sensed that something was really off. I don't know how to describe it to you, but I really felt that something was incredibly wrong. It was like the woods had taken on a menacing ambience, and all that cheerful, pretty birdsong in the valley had all receded, and all signs of life had vanished. I kid you not, I did not see a bird on a branch tweeting, nor did I see a squirrel nibbling acorns, or a rabbit diving into its burrow. Everything was deathly quiet and airily still, and the only thing I could hear was my breath before my face. In all my previous visits to the wood, they had never ever felt like this before. It was like I sensed a very ominous presence of evil. That's the only way I can explain it. I decided to leave the forest immediately. I wanted to listen to my gut, but very suddenly I was distracted by this hefty movement in the brush that got my attention. It sounded like something monstrously big was moving around in the heavy, overgrown thicket. And whatever it was, this thing was huge. It sounded like a rhino or an elephant because when it moved, the ground thumped and vibrated under its monstrous weight. I think in that moment I was more curious than frightened because I was eager to find out what this thing could be. So I immediately took cover. I hid behind the trunk of a very old oak tree to see what would happen next. I heard the creature thundering through the high grass and bolting through it like a speed train on full throttle until he came to the open clearing, which was very near to where I was hiding. I could see this creature so clearly, and nothing prepared me for what I was actually seeing. It was a monstrous giant-like creature standing on two legs with a distinctly humanoid stature. He was covered from head to toe with long, silvery, straggly hair, and there was a look about him that reminded me of a silverback gorilla. He was, of course, infinitely bigger and was easily 8 feet tall and 800 pounds and approximately 5 feet wide. His head was shaped like a bullet with a very prominent and distinct brow ridge, large, deep-set yellow-brown eyes, a flat nose, and a very slender mouth. I noticed the creature kept looking over his shoulders as if he was expecting something or someone to appear through the brush. This surprised me because I didn't think it was even remotely conceivable that such a powerful creature with such an impressive, formidable proportion of dense muscle and superhuman strength could be in the slightest bit intimidated by any other living creature. I could see that this animal was without doubt an apex predator, without a single living foe. Of that I was certain. I watched the creature quickly straddle the tree trunk as if he was in a dreadful hurry. He prized his muscular thighs on the sides of the trunk and shimmied up its great girth with effortless ease, like a fireman sliding up a long pole. I watched him reach out with a hairy humanoid hand to grab a tree branch, and he twisted his body forwards, pulling himself up into the higher branches of the tree with the fluidness and dexterity of a gymnast. Suddenly I heard the voices of two men walking through the brush. One of them I recognized instantly as belonging to the neighborhood farmer, who was a man we kids liked to call Farmer Bruce. I knew that he frequented these woods regularly for hunting practices. "It's usually a good spot to hunt here," I heard his familiar voice saying. "But today, for some reason, it's deathly quiet. Normally this place is teeming with wildlife. There are some prime specimen of whitetail around here." "I don't like the feel of this place," came the other voice. "It feels a little creepy to me." "It's not normally like this, I promise you," came Bruce's reassuring voice. "We could build a deer stand around here," he continued. "This would be a good spot because the creek is on the left-hand side, and the deer tend to approach it on this side." "I'm not sure about this," said the other man. "I'm just not comfortable about the place. It feels like something is watching us." The two men were now literally standing under the very tree where the hairy humanoid was hiding, and I imagine his predatory eyes were pinned directly on them. I literally stood behind the oak tree, only yards away, not daring to move. I was absolutely terrified that even the sound of my fast breathing could be heard by this creature. I wish I had possessed the courage to call out to the men to warn them about the creature that was lurking in the tree. But I was so incapacitated by fear, and my only thoughts were to stay as quiet as I possibly could, with the hope that I would finally get out of the woods alive. I'm afraid to admit it, I was in survival mode, thinking only about saving my own skin. Suddenly the creature let out the most terrifying growl, and it was unlike anything I have ever heard. "Ah! Ah!" It was such a dreadful sound that it caused the whole ground to vibrate, and the men almost lost their balance for a moment as the ground quaked. The two men looked utterly terrified. I noticed Farmer Bruce was wobbling violently and clutching his rifle, looking through the undergrowth to see if he could detect something with his beady eyes, but he saw nothing. "What the hell was that?" he cried out in horror. "I told you something isn't right about this place," said the other man. "Let's get out of here right now." Suddenly the monstrous creature jumped out of the tree, landing yards away from the terrified men, with the agility of a domestic cat, but with such a heavy thud that everything vibrated, like the shock waves you get from a mild earthquake. It was just like that. The two men screamed in terror. "No! No! No!" Farmer Bruce stumbled and fell a few times, looking back at the creature like a hunted animal, and running backwards from it as fast as he possibly could, tearing through the undergrowth at a very impressive speed. The other man seemed unable to move, because he was shaking so very much, and I believe he was utterly frozen. He seemed incapacitated by fear. I have seen this behaviour a lot in animals when they're being attacked by a predator, especially with the feral cats on our farm, when they started to pursue a mouse. Sometimes the poor mouse was so frozen in terror, it became an easy target for the cat. Farmer Bruce's friend just stood there, paralysed, unable to move. His Arctic blue eyes became as round and as wide as saucers, and his jaw hung to the ground with a look of horror written over his pale face that had drained almost completely of colour. The creature lunged towards him, whirled his lanky body in the air like it was a Catherine wheel. He went whizzing around and around and around, and then falling over a snapped tree branch, and he became impaled by the thing like a large piece of skewered beef being pierced through a sharp pole. The face of the man became frozen in fear, with wide terrified eyes and an open mouth that lay fixed in position, accounting the horrified last minutes of this poor man's life. He was definitely deceased, and the blood was pouring from the branch and trickling onto the ground, where it congealed into a thick bloody gel. Looking at this poor man dying in this way was positively the most horrific thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. I could hardly believe what I was actually seeing. The creature was chattering to itself excitedly, as if he'd really enjoyed the adrenaline rush of killing this man in such a horrifying way. And he licked some of the man's dripping blood off his sausage-sized finger and tasted it. Then what he did next was the most repulsive, shocking thing that I've ever witnessed in my entire life. I literally watched this creature gouge out the man's eyes from its sockets with his thick fingers and pop them into his mouth like they were delicious sweets. He smacked his lips afterwards as if he'd really relished the taste of them. I knew that in some parts of the world they do eat sheep eyeballs, which are considered a treat, but seeing this sent shivers down my spine, and the corpse of the man just looked even more terrifying, with two wide gaping sockets just staring blankly into space from the tree branch. It was like something out of the most vile horror movie. I was the one now, behind the tree, shaking in fear, and too frozen to the spot to even flinch or move a muscle. I could feel my heart pounding through my chest, and I was so terrified that it was loud enough that the predator could actually hear it. There is no way, I know, of how to still the sound of a heavy, loud, violent heartbeat. The creature slapped the face of the dead corpse as if it was a plaything. And then he seemed to lose interest pretty fast, and I watched him glide away on his long, hairy, muscular legs, and he moved with such agility and grace, and was gone from my sight so fast, but my relief was short-lived. Suddenly I heard the sounds of men's voices, slamming car doors, rifles firing off warning sounds, and then I saw the police. They were creeping in the woods with their rifles at the ready, and there were lots of them. I could hear them talking to Farmer Bruce. "It happened around here," he said, pointing to the spot where his friend now lay impaled by the tree trunk. I could hear the audible gasps as the policeman and Farmer Bruce just stared in shocked horror at the dead body of his friend that was impaled by the tree, and they gasped when they saw the hollowed-out sockets for the eyes. "What the heck?" said the police officer. "How in God's name did this happen?" I could hear Farmer Bruce's voice wobbling uneasily. "Maybe he tried to climb the tree to escape the creature, and he fell." "What kind of creature did you say it was that you saw?" "I didn't get to see it closely," I heard Farmer Bruce lie. "It all happened so fast. I think it was a black bear. I could see this black shadowy form, and I just ran away." "But how did this poor man lose his eyes like this? I hardly think this is the work of a black bear. They don't behave like this in a human attack." "Could it not just be a vulture of some kind?" said Farmer Bruce, offering a feeble explanation for the missing eyeball. "You'll have to come back with us to the station, sir, to file out a report. In the meantime, I'll get the coroner to examine the body before we move it." I want to tell you that I crept out of the woods as quietly and as silently as I could, taking the back way. I was so shocked by what I had seen that I found myself in a state of shock for a very long time afterwards. Even my foster family commented on how unusually quiet and withdrawn I had become over recent days, and they usually took such little interest in my comings and goings, so for them to notice my subdued demeanour was very impressive, to say the least. One night over dinner, my foster father was discussing Farmer Bruce's strange encounter. "He reckons it was a black bear that chased him," said my father. "I'm not sure about that. In my experience, you do not run from a bear, and that's exactly what he did. His friend got impaled on a tree branch while escaping the creature, and he fell onto it. It was a terrible, tragic accident. But get this, his friend's eyeballs were gouged out. Now that's not a bear." "I agree," said my foster mother. "That doesn't sound like a bear attack to me." "Have you seen anything strange in the woods, Marcus?" asked my foster father suddenly. "I know you go there a lot." No, I lied, flushing a bright red colour. I've not seen anything. Can I have more of that cauliflower, please? I said, trying to change the subject quickly. I thought you hated cauliflower, said my foster mother, passing me a bowl of the congealed muck. Oh, no! I love it, I said, piling my plate with heaps of the No, I love it, I said, piling my plate with a heap of disintegrated mush and stuffing large amounts of it into my mouth to avoid being cross-examined by my parents, who were both looking at me curiously. Now, Marcus, snapped my foster mother. Try not to put too much food into your mouth at once. It's not a pretty sight for the rest of us to see. You must be very careful in those woods, Marcus, said my father. I know we let you run wild around the place, but there are things in those woods that cannot be explained. Believe me, I know. I grew up here in Kentucky, and I've seen things myself that defy explanation, let me tell you that. Tell them about the time you saw the wolf man, dear, said my mother, nagging her husband. Go on, dear. It's time our kids know the real dangers that lie out there. I nearly spat the cauliflower all over the table in shock. You saw a wolf man? I asked, my eyes growing as round as saucers. I did, said my foster father. As he recounted his experience to the rest of us, he physically started to shake. I realised in horror that my foster father had also had a strange encounter once that had truly ruffled his feathers, so much so that the mere memory of the event was actually giving him the jitters, and for the first time in my life I actually felt sympathy towards him. I knew personally from my own gut-wrenching experience how harrowing his encounter must have been. Go on, tell them, urged my foster mother again. Our kids need to hear the truth. What happened? Asked my foster brother eagerly. Tell us, Dad, please. Well, it was in 1962, when I was coming home from a party. A friend of mine had invited over 100 people to an amazing barbecue, and it was a long drawn-out affair, but we all had a very good time. I had a girlfriend at the time, Angie, I think her name was. She was a pretty little thing, really. But she didn't hold a candle to your mother, of course, he said, reaching out to touch my stepmother's hand. I remember looking at my stepmother and secretly thinking that the entire female population was infinitely more attractive than she was. Anyway, he continued, we went into the woods to get away from the rest of the crowd. I had a flashlight with me, and I liked the idea of spending some lone time with Angie. I bet you did, teased my foster mother. Your father was always a player. He always had an eye for the ladies. Whereabouts was this? Asked my brother. A few miles from here, son, he said. Angie was a giggler, he continued. She just could not stop giggling when we entered the woods. And she started talking all about ghosts and all kinds of scary things. It was because when we entered the woods it was really very creepy. I can't explain it to you, but we thought someone was actually watching us. And I will tell you this, the whole place gave me the heebie-jeebies. It was very unsettling. Then we saw it. Saw what? Asked my brother. The wolf man, of course, snapped my father. Stop interrupting me, son. I'm trying to tell you the story. It was standing there on a branch of a tree, looking down on us with these evil glowing red eyes. And this thing was monstrously huge. He was about 7 feet tall and 500 pounds, and he had the face of a wolf, but he was standing upright on 2 legs like a human. He was covered with thick grey hair, and his mouth was oversized for his face, and when he growled, all you could see was those sharp, white, dagger-like teeth. When he growled, the noise was so piercing it went right through you. The creature started to break pieces of the branch off the tree, and he threw them at us. Oh, and we hightailed it out of the woods as fast as we could, I can tell you. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. Do you know what? Angie refused to see me after that. That was the end of our relationship." "Do you think that that is what Farmer Bruce saw?" asked my brother suddenly. "I'm certain of it," said my father. "He's definitely lying about what he saw in the woods. The creature that I saw fits the profile exactly. It would have happily gouged out that person's eyes. I'm sure it was the wolfman that was responsible for the attack. And you know what? Farmer Bruce is not telling anyone about it. He's worried about what people will think." "Yes," said my brother, "but why did the wolfman not run off with the body to eat it? Surely he would have devoured everything." "Maybe he wasn't hungry," said my father. "Or he could have heard the police entering the woods and panicked and run off." I sat listening to them all pontificating about the mystery creature that had attacked the farmer's friend. Little did they know I was sitting on all the answers, and they were veering way off course because the creature responsible for the attack was indeed a humanoid ape, and most certainly not a wolfman. I was determined to never tell anyone what I had seen, not only because they would have been unlikely to believe me, but because I felt ashamed that I had not warned those men about that nasty creature in the tree. For a long time I did not visit the woods after my encounter, but I began to miss it so much that I finally overcame my fear. But I always took my stepfather's rifle with me, and I learnt to leave the forest well alone if things became strangely quiet. One evening when my foster sister Amelia, who was 18 years old, one time went for an evening stroll with her new boyfriend in the woods, they both returned home deathly pale, swearing that they'd both seen a ghost in the woods, with huge hollows for eyes, wearing a blue plaid shirt. "He just disappeared in front of our eyes," said Amelia. "What did he look like?" I asked. "He was thin and lanky, with white hair, hollows for the eyes, and wearing tan pants and the blue plaid shirt. And get this, he had a huge bleeding hole in his stomach area." "It was definitely a ghost," said her boyfriend Kirk. "It looked at us and vanished before us." "I think you're describing Farmer Bruce's friend," I said to Amelia. "Remember the man that got impaled by the tree branch and died?" "Oh, yes," said Amelia. "I remember the story. It must be him. Maybe he does not know he's dead, and he's wandering around the woods." After my sister's sighting of the impaled ghost in our area, there were many other people who claimed to have seen his ghost. So many paranormal investigators over the years definitely frequented the area and claimed to have recordings of his voice and EVPs. Anyway, so that is my story. But I will say this to you. I never remained close to my family. I never remained close to my family once I left home, and we never remained in touch, and I've never ever missed them. Over the years I did get married and have kids of my own, and I adopted a foster child and gave him everything I never had growing up, and I love him as much as all my natural children, and give him everything that I give them. I also want to say that I discovered the creature that I saw in the woods all those years ago was indeed a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. But only then my wife and family knew about my encounter. But now you do too. And I hope you enjoyed my story.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Steve. But the story I'm going to tell you needs to remain anonymous for my own personal protection. I cannot give you names, places or dates, but I will tell you my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter because I'm absolutely certain it would be of great interest to your audience of listeners. I have been working for a fire department in North America for many long years now. My father is now a retired fire chief, and as a kid growing up, I always hung around the fire station after school, during the weekends and school holidays, as I was equally as passionate about being a fireman as my father was, and maybe even more so. I would spend countless hours at the fire station, shining the fire engines up with cleaning cloths, buffing them up so that the beautiful red and silver metal literally gleamed and sparkled to a perfect shine, so much so that you could literally see your own reflection staring back at you.
I would sit in the fire engine on the driver's seat with my tiny little hands on the steering wheel, making all those brumming sounds with my mouth and envisaging myself driving this marvellous piece of machinery one day. When I was a little older, I worked as a volunteer firefighter, but I never worked at my father's station because of the fear of being accused of nepotism. Finally, I did actually get a job as a full-time firefighter, and my dream came into fruition. Believe me when I say it is not a job for the faint-hearted. The men who work in this business are both passionate, dedicated, courageous individuals whom are willing to work demanding and grueling 24-hour shifts. Being a fireman is usually born from an intense desire and drive to help people in all kinds of eventualities, many times choosing to save people's lives at the very risk of losing your own. Truly, there is nothing more satisfying to me in this world than saving someone's life. It makes my life so worthwhile, rewarding and fulfilling. I have so many stories to tell of people that our fire brigade has miraculously saved, that were seemingly situations so devoid of any hope. This would have invariably amounted to horrifying consequences too dreadful to even comprehend. So many firefighters possess this incredible, remarkable, fast, quick-witted, creative and ingenious thinking that really does contribute greatly to saving so many lives. My job involves responding to fires, explosions, car accidents and medical emergencies. We spend ages cleaning our trucks and service equipment, and we often talk to community groups and schools. We teach kids as well as members of the public all about fire safety and what to do if you have an accidental fire at your home, and how to manage the situation lest it gets out of control. Most of the men I work with tend to work 24 hours on and 48 hours off schedules, typically starting and ending shifts at about 7 a.m. The first thing we do on a shift is to ensure that all our equipment, like our trucks and breathing apparatus, are in apple pie order. We then tend to engage in an hour of physical fitness daily to make sure we keep in great physical shape for the demands of our jobs, because believe me, you do not want to be out of shape when you're tackling a challenging fire, because dealing with that intense heat and the physical exertion can take exhaustion to a whole new level. We also do our bit at the fire department to help in disaster relief, like ice storms, wildfires and hurricanes. And of course, our jobs are not without major risks. And on average, I have to say that about 10 firefighters lose their lives tragically in North America every year. And these men are truly fallen heroes, in my opinion. My story begins when we were called out to an area of natural forest where many campers were being trapped by the ravages of a wild, rampant, orange-red fiery inferno that was spreading dangerously fast, literally carpeting the entire valley with blankets of thick velvet black smoke that was curling, rolling and folding down the natural timber like pieces of tissue paper. The first thing we did as a team was to douse the existing fire with water and spray down the area with fire retardants. It was a tough job and exhausting work. People were being rescued from areas totally overwhelmed with the hot inferno. Many survivors were being evacuated by helicopters, and for many witnesses, they described what they saw as being like Armageddon. Being caught up in a forest fire is a terrifying ordeal for people, and sometimes even the fear associated with the terror can be more deadly than the fire itself. As firefighters, we are equipped to deal with these harrowing, treacherous experiences with a steely courage and conviction. As I was dousing the fire, I noticed a bedraggled heap of what I can only describe as a mass of singed hair lying in the corner under a tree, barely breathing. I suddenly noticed that the strange hairy form appeared to be moving, and so I dashed over to what I assumed was a person wearing a somewhat peculiar looking fuzzy coat of some kind to give them the emergency life-saving help that they invariably needed. I realised almost immediately that this human was actually covered in real hair, and so it couldn't be human at all. But what was it? I could not imagine. In that moment I did not care, because my sole intention was to save this humanoid hairy form, regardless of what it was. The creature was about 4 feet tall, 300 pounds, and covered in hair that was singed by the fire and smelt burnt. To my horror, the poor creature was barely conscious, with seriously impaired, very shallow breathing, and there was a clear evidence of soot around the nose and mouth area. The creature's brown eyes were rolling back in their sockets, not a good sign, and it appeared both confused and disorientated. I immediately called Michelle, an EMT I often worked with in emergency situations, and whom I knew extremely well. We put the creature out of harm's way, away from all the prying eyes, behind some trees that had not been damaged by the fire, and on an open clearing that had been saturated with lots of water. Michelle was whispering to me and looking at me with a look of deep concern growing on her face. "Do not tell anyone about this," she said, looking at me intently with her kind blue eyes. "If the government finds out about this creature, they will definitely kill him. They don't want the public to know that it exists. We need to help it, or it will die." I looked at Michelle with a look of confusion on my face. "Michelle," I said, "what in God's name are you talking about? You're not making any sense at all." "Look," said Michelle, "can you not see? This creature is not human. I'm almost certain it's a little Bigfoot." I was stunned. I watched Michelle examining the creature and measuring its vitals and administering oxygen to the animal. The creature was in a very bad way, and I truly thought it wasn't going to pull through. It looked like the life was literally ebbing from its body, and it seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. And when this happens, you usually get the most grim outcome you can imagine, and the creature normally dies. But Michelle continued to oxygenate the creature's blood until it started splattering and coughing violently, and a black coal-like tar emerged from its mouth. I suddenly had this very strange feeling that I was being watched. Michelle and I looked up, and we both saw this monstrous-looking creature standing behind a tree, watching us intently, with a look of heightened concern on its face. I realized almost immediately that this was the Bigfoot's mother, who was clearly terrified about losing her child. She watched us closely, seemingly unfazed that we could see her so clearly. On the contrary, she wanted us to know that she was there, waiting for her child. She seemed to understand that we were doing our level best to save its life. I looked up at her only very briefly, as I was so intent on helping the little Bigfoot to recover and regain full consciousness, because there was no way we could take the strange humanoid to the hospital in an ambulance without drawing too much unwelcome attention to the creature, and that's the last thing we wanted to do. The mother Bigfoot was absolutely enormous. She must have been 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, and she was covered in coal-black hair from head to foot. It was clear that she was female, not only because of her gentle feminine energy, but her pert breast tissue on her chest told me that she was definitely female. She stood there watching us continuously with very soft brown eyes. She had a cone-shaped head that had a tiny little point on the top and blended seamlessly into a pair of enormous shoulders. The creature was in far better shape than many of the firefighters that work at our station, because every part of her body rippled with muscle, and she was shredded and ripped. Her arms were long like that of a primate, but they were exceedingly strong and muscular like that of a very strong man. In a nutshell, she looked like a humanoid ape. As the creature coughed, it spat out a lot more of that nasty-looking black-like soot, and suddenly it seemed to come out of its confused state, and its little frightened brown eyes looked up at us in surprise, with a look of confusion all over its face. Almost immediately the mother started chattering away to the creature in some kind of strange language that sounded remarkably like gibberish. However, what she was saying to the little Bigfoot enabled him to physically relax and almost immediately calm down. He seemed to surrender comfortably to the help we were administering to him without any resistance. Much to my relief, the oxygen therapy we gave the creature and the medication clearly brought it out of its confused state very fast, and before long it got up and ran into its mother's arms. The reunion between the two was so touching that I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. The mother ran her huge humanoid hands through the little creature's hair, pulling away some of the black muck entangled within its hairy layers, and she wet her fingers with her pink tongue and wiped the black soot away from the little creature's mouth area with a very large finger. The little creature rubbed its little hairy face into its mother's downy stomach and clutched its mother's arm tightly with its hands. I looked up, and the mother Bigfoot looked directly at me and held my gaze, and in that moment it appeared that she was painting a picture in my mind. Suddenly I saw it very clearly. It was a vivid picture of a little Bigfoot sitting on a tree, waiting for its mother to return. I then felt this gratitude and thankfulness flood over me. It was like this Bigfoot mother was telling me that she had left her baby up in the tree and asked him to wait there for her, which it had done dutifully, to its own peril, which was why it got ravaged by that horrible fire. It truly felt that she was thanking us for our fast intervention in saving her child's life. All I can say is this: I have never experienced anything like this before. I believe it was telepathic communication, and to affirm it, Michelle had also received exactly the same message from the Bigfoot mother when she had looked directly into both of our eyes. The Bigfoot mother then nodded to us and turned around with her little child's legs wrapped around her hips and shoulders. We watched her glide away into the forests, and she moved with such agility and grace. She was so beautiful to watch, and I shed a happy tear as I watched them go. "Thank you," said Michelle, looking at me gratefully. "Thank you so much for your discretion. I never knew that Bigfoot was real until a few moments ago. But I knew if this got out, that we had found a Bigfoot child, I'm almost certain that the government would have sworn everyone to secrecy and maybe eliminated the creature. I couldn't let that happen to him. He deserves to live in peace and be reunited with his mother, like he happily is now. Look how happy and grateful she was." "I wholeheartedly agree," I said. "I'm glad we've kept this secret." I walked away from that experience thrilled to have saved the Bigfoot's life and to have encountered two seemingly serene, very gentle creatures that are formidable but majestic at the same time. It did make me realize that there is much more to this world than we imagine, and that we need to preserve and protect our forests so that these elusive, wonderful creatures can thrive. They deserve respect and to be treated with compassion because they're extraordinary, remarkable, and intelligent creatures. I do not want your listeners to think that fires are all bad news, because they can have invaluable benefits to the earth, like cracking seeds open to encourage germination in the fertile, ashy ground. It also destroys the thick understory in the forest, which reduces competition for seedlings, encouraging new growth and providing food for animals. Having said all that, the increase in wildfires in recent years has been attributed to global warming, and sometimes the damage on the ground can be so severe that it loses its ability to retain fluid, causing loss of vegetation and damage to lakes and rivers. I must confess that on the subject of the hairy humanoid known as Bigfoot, I truly never considered the existence of such a creature remotely plausible. But now I realize that I was very wrong. This creature is real. It gives me a greater determination to preserve our forests more than ever before here in North America, keeping the natural habitat of these forests thriving and abundant for these beautiful and majestic creatures.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.